Hi everyone, it's Swank Ivy, and it's time for another Letters to an Asexual. This is number 83. So a couple warnings to start off. As you might be able to tell from the video title here, this video contains pretty aggressive asexuality invalidation. Though later in the conversation this person insisted he was being polite and not at all malicious, because, you know, if they don't use swear words or actively threaten you, their content should always be interpreted as civil discourse. So there is also passing mention of corrective rape. Background, an asexual YouTube user commented on my prejudice and discrimination video by sharing her experience worrying about corrective rape and saying it really disturbs her that she's expected to have sex with men to prove whether she likes it. I responded with a reassuring and supportive message. And then a month later, this fellow popped up and replied to that same person's insecure comment with this: "Can you not have orgasms?" I thought that was an incredibly inappropriate thing to say to someone who had expressed her difficult experience with being expected to engage in sex, but figured he didn't understand why this isn't cool. So I assumed he was not trying to be hurtful, and I replied to him in kind. My response: some asexual people do, and some asexual people don't. Not everyone wants to. There are more polite ways to ask this sort of question if you'd please be a little less blunt in the future. Asking in the general helps. Can you tell me about whether asexual people experience climax versus asking an individual for specific personal information about themselves? Unless they've made it clear that they're inviting questions like that. He returned with a pretty obvious misconception and some snotty entitlement. Apologies. Didn't realize orgasm was such a taboo word. Considering you made a public video regarding your sexuality, I figured it wouldn't be an issue, but if climax is somehow semantically better, then fair enough. Some climax? How can someone be asexual, yet have sexual needs? That seems contradictory. I would think climax would be directly related to some form of sexual desire or need, and not everyone wants to, as in there is an instinctive need, but conscious desire to suppress it? That sounds like a mental or behavioral issue. What separates asexuality from a physiological disorder, like low testosterone, etc.? How can having an abnormally low or no libido be an orientation? See what I mean when I say he posts really horrific stuff, but he thinks he's being polite? Anyway, this conversation is super long, so my reply: No, you made an assumption here and ran with it. I don't object at all to the word orgasm. I just gave you a sample sentence in case you didn't understand what I mean by please ask in the general when you're asking such a personal question. And I just happened to use a different word. Just so it's very explicitly stated, I'm saying you should not ask people, do you XYZ, when it has to do with their sex life or their genitals, unless they have personally invited questions of that nature, and you're replying to one of my commenters, not asking the question to me who made the video. Maybe you didn't notice that. As for how can someone be asexual yet have sexual needs, that's also a broad misconstruction of what asexuality is. Since I've made a ton of videos on the topic, just so I don't have to say it repeatedly, I'll just refer you to my asexuality and overview video, so you can understand the difference between asexuality and ability to orgasm. And I'll also note that you conflated can you orgasm with sexual needs here. Some people can physically orgasm, but wouldn't describe themselves to have sexual needs. If someone can masturbate and come to climax but never feels any kind of urge to do so, that's still a person who can have an orgasm but doesn't fit into either side of your dichotomy. Finally, nope, this sounds like it's a mental or behavioral issue is very, 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 very commonly bandied about as a way to invalidate asexual people even before someone understands what asexuality is, as you seem not to have a firm grasp on yourself. I'm not saying that in an insulting way, but I am saying that before you go telling us what we are and what we're not, you should probably first understand what we're even claiming to be. Asexuality does not make any statements whatsoever about libido, and asexuality is not a psychological disorder. If you're interested in the opinion and research of sexologists, psychologists, and the mental health community, I suggest getting an up-to-date diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, 5th edition, and check out how asexuality is discussed. The short version is that it is explicitly identified in the DSM in discussions of sexual disorders as not being a sexual disorder. You may also want to Google the site Asexual Explorations for a list of the extant research on the subject published by those who have been researching it. That may give you a clearer picture of what has already been done by people who have investigated it in a way you might respect without me having to reinvent the wheel. So, that was pretty comprehensive, but of course it wasn't enough for him. He's back! And of course, not only does he repeatedly refuse to read the resources I recommended, or correct himself, but he also gives me a bunch of, but proof is needed commentary on what he thinks asexuality is, with suggestions that he has totally read about asexuality, but somehow has only gleaned information that is wildly untrue. Here's his next reply. Okay, fair enough on the climax issue. He quotes me, "If someone can masturbate and come to climax but never feels any kind of urge to do so, that's still a person who can have an orgasm but doesn't fit into either side of your dichotomy." End quote. How can one definitively prove beyond speculation that asexuals do not feel any sexual urges? Are there actual scientific tests that can be performed to establish this, such as checking for hormonal or mental imbalances that would stifle libido in some way? I read, for instance, that the brains of homosexuals are a bit different from the brains of heterosexuals, but there was no mention if asexuals had any differences. Is it all simply based on personal accounts and testimony in which individuals who claim to be asexual are simply telling people they have no desire? If one is not sexually aroused in some way, how is conscious climax achieved, if not for some random, unintended physical reaction, like a nocturnal emission, aka wet dream? As an aside, I love that he thinks he needs to explain what a wet dream is. Anyway, if a conscious asexual male is with a woman and achieves erection, has sex, and climaxes, it seems counterintuitive to suggest he had no desire whatsoever. I have looked at various asexual sites, but have not been able to find any scientific concrete evidence that supports asexuality beyond speculation, derived from polling and studies. I have also read that women are more likely to be asexual, which makes sense to me because even though women are just as sexually needy, they aren't as sexually extroverted as men. And I've also read that people who claim to be asexual also commonly have other social or behavioral issues. That's why I asked if it could be a disorder of some kind, especially considering the small amount of people who actually identify as asexual. Ah, yeah, because asexuality is totally the untested claim that we have no desire whatsoever. And it's totally common for orientations to be about what our genitals do. I reply, think of it this way. How can one prove beyond speculation that heterosexual people do not feel any same-sex sexual urges? Have they gone to labs to prove that they aren't at all gay? No? Then how can they expect us not to repeatedly ask them to prove their straightness to us? How, outside of a laboratory, can we, the rational scientific people, be expected to take their word for it when describing their subjective experience of sexual attraction? We can't. So instead of understanding that a sexual orientation is a description of what a person feels, nothing more, I'm going to claim that orientation is a scientific demonstration measured by someone else, using someone else's standards, and if they have not done what I believe is a scientific experiment that accurately measures their orientation, I will subject those straight people to invalidation and inquiry whenever I see them discussing their experience. If you think asexuality is anything beyond a person communicating their subjective experience of sexual attraction, just like anyone of any other sexual orientation, you do not know what it is. And after I explicitly told you, you haven't absorbed the basic definition of asexuality before criticizing what you imagine it to be, I suppose I will have to acknowledge that you prefer to remain willfully ignorant. This is a dishonest position, which is odd considering it's coming from someone who ostensibly claims to be interested in research, but I digress. If you have looked at various asexual sites, but have not been able to find anything scientific, I'm curious why you didn't go to the site I specifically guided you to, which has multiple scientific studies, yes, even ones that measured asexual people's sexual responses to stimuli, conducted by non-asexual people on populations both asexual and not. It's almost as if you are looking for and accepting and reading only material that proves what you already wanted to believe, which is known as confirmation bias. Actual scientific studies explicitly do not find higher social or behavioral issues among asexual populations, so it's suspicious that you're claiming that's the case. I'll interrupt myself to say that some studies have suggested asexual people may experience more depression and anxiety than the typical population, which is in line with people who are queer or, in fact, marginalized in any way, including poverty. Imagine that! Living with an unusual amount of difficulties makes a person depressed or anxious. Those are not social or behavioral issues in the way this person is suggesting, though. Back to my response. As for small number of people, the estimated percentage is 1%. That is millions of people. That means it's more common than people in the United States military. If something automatically becomes more likely to be a disorder because there are fewer people experiencing it, I don't even know how to logic that. I personally don't believe people should be required to produce evidence of scientific investigation to put a name on a specifically subjective experience, just like people don't require a scientific test before they respect that someone identifying as straight actually is straight. But there have always been double standards for non-heteronormative identities. And it doesn't surprise me that we are held to different and sometimes impossible standards. Proving a negative isn't scientifically possible, and asexual people are not claiming that they have done so by identifying as asexual. They are not proving, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that they couldn't feel something sexual or experience attraction in the future, but that's how sexual orientations work for everyone. They are an attempt to put a name on a pattern that in the past and in the present is true for them, and past and present are best descriptors of the future. There is sexual fluidity for asexual people and for all people, and there is room for discovery, but just like most straight people don't eventually realize they're actually gay or bi, most asexual people don't experience fluidity or feel they are required to experiment exhaustively before they are allowed to call themselves asexual. I don't know why so many people become so invested in changing us and burrowing into our motivations, looking for a problem, a flaw, a disorder, a disease, and respond to asexuality with aggressive questioning and demands for investigation, as if this is what we must expect as a prerequisite to being treated with basic respect. Oh, and we'll be expected to perform it and demonstrate it and prove it for every person who asks and doubts us, too. I do find it to be a shame that there are people who think science is the only thing that can prove asexuality, especially when their demands aren't even scientific and are laughably uneven when it comes to how it's applied to us versus, say, straight people. But considering there actually is science on this subject that people routinely ignore and claim doesn't exist, I don't know what people actually want from us. I told you it's in the DSM, and you were free to look up Lori Brotto's work and the backstory of her push to have asexuality recognized as not a disorder in that manual. I suggested you look at Asexual Explorations, which is a list of studies that have been done on the topic. I did not suggest, but will now, that you check out Anthony Bogart's work. He wrote a textbook called Understanding Asexuality, and it contains plenty of data on the subject. And there is also Mark Kerrigan, a sociologist whose review of my book, The Invisible Orientation, nailed down very well while he finds it distressing that people scramble to invalidate asexual people without even thinking about why it's so vital to them to do so. I'll link you to that here. I won't be so brazen as to suggest my book as a good read for you, though, because it is for the layperson and does not constitute a scientific examination of the topic. The people I'm recommending here are not asexual, so they do not have a horse in the race. To sum up, if you can't find any scientific evidence of asexuality being a real thing, you are terrible at researching. And I think your failure to do so might be influenced by your own prejudices. I have seen comments just like yours many, many times before, consisting of people who are so sure no real or respectable research has been done that they say so without actually looking at what has been done over the last 2 decades. And I really think if you are truly driven by scientific curiosity, you should begin approaching this subject with authentic inquiry. That, or stop posting conclusions about it that do not reflect anything close to reality. If you reply to this and it's clear to me from your response that you did not read or absorb any of the resources I gave you, I do not plan to continue responding to you. As a final thought, you might enjoy reading my blog post, Don't Science My Orientation, for a perspective on why conversations like this are rarely productive. But I don't know if you will take away from it a good sense of what we experience and why your expectations don't sound reasoned or reasonable to us. Well, I figured that he would either be scared off by the wall of text or respond with personal incredulity about the inappropriate level of emotion about my response and assigning me a persecution complex. Wow, it's almost like I've had conversations exactly like this with similar tools before. Oh, and watch as he continues to claim we, unlike other orientations, need to be validated or else it's just natural to assume we're wrong and have issues. His next comment. I realize you cannot prove such a thing, but social or sexual behavioral history would be a great indicator. If a person is attracted sexually to the same sex and has a history of acting out those feelings, it's reasonable to conclude they are gay, and vice versa. If someone simply refrains from sex, it seems more difficult to conclude asexuality because a history of abstinence isn't directly related to the claim of being asexual. There could be a magnitude of other reasons for it. Since lack of sexual behavior can be a product of countless issues, it's a lot more difficult to validate the claim of asexuality than it is to validate the claim of being gay or straight, in my opinion, especially if one still exhibits desire. And I'm not saying that anyone has to prove anything, I'm simply stating the obvious, which is that it's more difficult to support the claim of asexuality beyond simply taking one's word for it than it is to support someone who claims they are straight, bi, or gay. I'm not criticizing asexuality, no matter how much it oddly appears you want me to be. When did I ever suggest asexuality is something negative? Please work on your comprehension before calling someone ignorant. My statement was simply that there is no evidence to support your claims, and that your claims are much more difficult to circumstantially support than claiming either hetero or homosexuality. I have read enough information on the subject to conclude this. He quotes me, "Actual scientific studies explicitly do not find higher social or behavioral issues among asexual populations, so it's suspicious that you're claiming that's the case." He elaborates, "I think it's suspicious that you won't admit it's arguable." I have read articles stating that asexuals are more likely to exhibit certain social or behavioral issues. So it is apparently arguable. Depending on whose studies you read and subscribe to, you obviously have an agenda and narrative to fulfill. So just as you accuse me of doing, you would also flock to findings that support your perspective. I realize there's an ongoing debate regarding classifying asexuals, but to deny the debate is dishonest on your part. There is no conclusive evidence separating asexuality from hypoactive sexual desire disorder, beyond people not wanting to be labeled with a disorder, and thus lobbying for change. He quotes me again, "If something automatically becomes more likely to be a disorder because there are fewer people experiencing it, I don't even know how to logic that." And he comments, "Considering most disorders reside within a minority in some shape or form, I'm not sure how that's hard to logic, but whatever. In any event, I'm done with this discussion. It's apparent you are hyper-defensive on the subject to a point where you are blatantly and irrationally implying people are prejudiced. Sounds like you have some real persecution issues. Good luck with your struggle." Of course, this is really about the semantics of what is arguable. Because he's witnessed people writing crappy articles on why we're actually a disorder, so therefore this is a worthwhile position. And using our small numbers against us to suggest it's more likely we're disordered is totally logical. Real failure of cause and effect here, since I imagine a minority of our population likes Hello Kitty. And nobody says liking Hello Kitty is more likely to be a disorder until or unless it's an opinion shared by the majority. My reply: yeah, it's pretty common for people to roll in, say ignorant things about asexuality, and then assign the people who correct them hyper-defensiveness because they corrected them. I didn't refuse to admit that it's arguable for people to claim we have a disorder, because obviously they are doing so. And have done so for a long time. It wasn't until the recent DSM-5 release that we were even acknowledged as existing, and I meant existing in the DSM editions, not in general. And your argument works against homosexual people too. It was argued for many years that being gay was a disorder. Refusing to acknowledge the validity of that belief is a very different thing from acknowledging that the argument has happened. Considering how often people, even in mental health fields, insist that asexuality is more likely to be a disorder than anything else, and want to subject asexual people to various interventions from simple psychological therapy to altering their hormones, it is very, very clear that there is a group of folks who make the argument you are making. I'm not denying their existence by saying they're wrong. And yes, asexuality, looking from the outside, very much like any other thing that leads to abstinence, does make it less recognizable. That's why listening to people becomes imperative. If what they're saying is, I don't feel sexually attracted to people, but I do have a sex drive, you can call that asexual. And some people do. Many of us experience sex drive, or even sexual experiences, as separate from our attractions, and many people who are not asexual have sex for reasons unrelated to being sexually attracted to others. Asexual people are people who are not sexually attracted to others. The other things associated with it are behavior. We are saying those two things are not necessarily related. It's pretty common for people to tell us that our masturbation habits or sex drives or ability to have orgasms indicates a problem if we still identify as asexual, though. Always interpreting it as an emotional problem or a stumbling block that could and should be worked through. To what end, for what reason, and for whose satisfaction, I don't know. And even though you say you don't expect anyone to prove anything, you make statements like, how can one definitively prove beyond speculation that asexuals do not feel any sexual urges? Are there actual scientific tests that can be performed to establish this? Considering no one here even said asexuals do not feel any sexual urges, and considering that feeling sexual arousal does not invalidate asexuality, we were never on the same page here. And yet, I could see you were looking for external proof of an internal experience. Asexuality is the name for what a person experiences regarding their attraction. It is not associated with whether they can have orgasms, whether they want or will tolerate sex, or what functionality their genitals have. Asexuality is not lack of sexual behavior. Asexuality is not inability to orgasm. Asexuality is not lack of genital function. Asexuality is not any of the things you seem to want to measure it by. And yet, you claim you're not saying anything negative, even though you explicitly said asexual people's word is not enough when compared to gay or straight people's word, because you believe their sexual behavior corroborates their position, while we just don't have enough evidence that you will accept. And you believe abstinence is what asexuality looks like, and that abstinence is associated with many things that aren't asexuality, which makes asexuality much more likely to be incorrect when someone reports it as their experience. This, by the way, is part of why I said you were ignorant, because you are still repeatedly demonstrating that you don't know the basic definition of asexuality, and you are refusing to incorporate that definition into your discussion of the matter, insisting instead on believing our experience is defined by abstinence, or a lack of physical response to sexual stimulation, which needs lab tests. The study conducted by Brado and Yule, entitled Physiological and Subjective Sexual Arousal in Self-Identified Asexual Women, dealt with this issue and found that asexual women did not have statistically significant differences in response to stimuli, and contrary to popular belief, this does not invalidate their asexual identity. It is an example of exactly what we're saying. I hope that in the future you do realize that invalidating someone's experience of themselves does constitute an aggressive, negative position, and that it is not unreasonable or indicative of a persecution complex to respond to such massive misconceptions by trying to correct and educate. Just because I said you were not educated on the topic and still clearly do not have an understanding of the extant research does not mean I am failing to comprehend you. And just because I react to your blunt expression of beliefs that routinely hurt my community with strongly worded attempts to correct you does not mean I am enjoying my so-called struggle. If you had any idea how consistently attitudes like yours have worsened the lives of already vulnerable people because they were held by people who were treating them in mental and physical health capacities, maybe you would be less eager to insist on the kinds of investigation and inquiry that you find reasonable. So, as you can imagine, he was full of lies when he said he was done with this discussion. On we go. I made no malicious claims, ignorant perhaps, but certainly not disparaging. I asked questions and gave opinions. The fact that you responded defensively, making accusatory assumptions of bigotry, is why I think you are hyper-defensive. And I realized they tried to claim homosexuality was a disorder or a mental illness. Same for trans people. The difference in the argument, in my opinion, however, is that homosexuals and trans have urges and sexual needs and attraction, while asexuals apparently do not. Oh, well, we need to take note there. Trans people automatically have urges. Ugh. Oh my god, he is explicitly ignoring what I said about asexuality and urges. Ah! Anyway, continuing. Take the analogy of having the sense of smell, for instance. One might prefer a certain sense, but if one has no sense of smell at all, that would be a bit more extreme. You may prefer one thing to another sexually, but to be deprived of needs, desire, or attraction altogether seems an awful lot like a disorder, whether you agree or not. It would seem like having no desire and/or no attraction would be comparable to having a missing sense. I say this not because it's something you need as an individual, but because sexual attraction is so universally ingrained in us as a species that it's abnormal to be without it. Perhaps a better word would be abnormality. As I understand, no one wants to be labeled with a disorder. He quotes me, "I'm not denying their existence by saying they're wrong." And he comments, "Okay, so it's your opinion that they are wrong. Fair enough. But it's arguable, then it's hard to be sure who is correct when both sides make valid points. There really is nothing that objectively supports either view. Some people may think they need to change asexuals, but those people are no different from the people who feel they need to change gays. It shouldn't matter what others do, as long as they aren't hurting anyone." Okay, dude. Actively attempting to change people's sexual orientation totally isn't hurting anyone, am I right? It's just an opinion! Pfft. Aside from being denied the interest in what most people consider one of the most pleasurable experiences life has to offer, I really see only upside to being asexual. No risk of STDs or unwanted pregnancy, etc. Sounds pretty good, LOL. Oh my god. Of course he's saying this in the comments on a video about discrimination and prejudice experienced by asexual people. But LOL indeed. Good life for sure. Continuing with his reply, he quotes me, "It's pretty common for people to tell us that our masturbation habits or sex drives or ability to have orgasms indicates a problem if we still identify as asexual, though, always interpreting it as an emotional problem or a stumbling block that could and should be worked through. To what end and for what reason and for whose satisfaction, I don't know." And he unloads this wisdom. Because that's exactly what it looks like, so of course it's going to be common. There are so many contradictions in that behavior. How can a man physically achieve and sustain an erection, then climax with someone he has zero attraction to sexually? The thought of that is just so counterintuitive. Having said that, though, I don't think it's something that needs to be worked through. As long as people are happy being asexual, then why should it matter? He quotes me again, "And even though you say you don't expect anyone to prove anything, you make statements like, how can one definitively prove beyond speculation that asexuals do not feel any sexual urges? Are there actual scientific tests that can be performed to establish this?" Asking if evidence exists to support claims is different than demanding proof. I never demanded proof from you. I asked. You make it seem like I had the hot lights on you in the interrogation room, demanding this and that. Relax. I only asked because I was thinking that asexuality may be linked in some way to hormonal abnormalities, and or something that could be biologically observed, for instance, like the brain differences between hetero and homosexuals. He quotes me again, "Asexuality is not lack of sexual behavior. Asexuality is not inability to orgasm. Asexuality is not lack of genital function. Asexuality is not any of the things you seem to want to measure it by." I wasn't trying to measure asexuality strictly based on any of those things. I am, however, stating that the fact that asexuals don't lack in those categories, yet still have no sexual attraction to others, makes asexuality appear to be some type of mental, emotional, social, behavioral, or intimacy issue. I'm simply stating the obvious. Oh, God. Quoting me, "This, by the way, is part of why I said you were ignorant, because you are still repeatedly demonstrating that you don't know the basic definition of asexuality." Not sure why you keep insinuating I don't know the basic definition of asexuality. Just because I'm not as research and versed on the topic doesn't mean I don't know the basic premise. Not sure what comments I've made thus far that would lead you to believe I don't understand the basic definition of asexuality. Oh hey, I can't imagine! What comments could those have possibly been? Maybe all the ones where you demonstrated that you didn't know what it means? Up to and including this message? Ugh. He continues, which is simply the lack of sexual attraction to people and or lack of sexual desire. This understanding is why I asked my initial question to begin with, because I wasn't sure how someone with no desire and or urges could climax. Quoting me again, I hope that in the future you do realize that invalidating someone's experience of themselves does constitute an aggressive, negative position, and that it is not unreasonable or indicative of a persecution complex to respond to such massive misconceptions by trying to correct and educate. And he elaborates, perhaps to those who are defensive in nature. But there's nothing inherently aggressive and or negative about asking questions and sharing a differing opinion. And sorry, but you can't really validate your experience, so I don't have to invalidate it. Nor do I want or have a need to, so chill. If someone claims they can walk on water, I want to see the evidence, not to invalidate their claim, but to have their claim validated to me. The burden of proof is on those making the positive claim. And I don't have to agree with your claims. That's not being negative. That's having an objective, unbiased opinion that happens to differ from yours. I harbor no ill will for your beliefs and personal experiences and have no issue calling asexuality an orientation if that makes asexuals feel better. And trying to correct and educate shouldn't include implications of bigotry. You seem to keep missing this point. That's why I think you are defensive. If you are hurt by anything I have said in this discussion, you are over-emotional in my opinion. I may not agree with you, but I have not said anything negative about you. Point out any malicious negative claims I made about you or asexuality in general. Go ahead. Where are all these asexual community shattering comments that would worsen the lives of asexuals? As for attitude like mine, you mean people who are curious about the very confusing and complicated topic of asexuality? How is that a bad attitude? And how does that harm your community? Your problem is that you think just because I recognize that asexuality could be a social or behavioral issue, I must think it's bad and or needs correcting. You've mentioned numerous times now about treatment and interventions, etc. It's clear you have persecution issues because you are constantly referencing persecution. As I said, I don't feel people who share your experience need correcting. There is nothing negative about your experience, in my opinion, yet you keep alluding to this idea, in my opinion, based on your persecution complex, that I feel otherwise, and that's not the case. And I know I said my last comment was my last, but I felt compelled to respond, LOL. This will, however, be my last comment. Take care. Yeah, I mean, it's just an opinion shared by many people who have used that opinion to destroy lives. An opinion that's unbiased and such, offered by people who put community in scare quotes and expect me not to see that as mocking. My response, quoting him, I made no malicious claims. Intention doesn't cut it. I made it clear that the types of things you said have hurt my community and many individuals within it, and that I didn't like that you were doubling down to support them. I didn't walk onto this baseball field to hit you with a bat. Doesn't mean that you didn't do it if you threw the bat and it hit me. So it's irrelevant whether you believe you're hurting people or whether you intended to. Quoting him, to be deprived of needs, desire, attraction altogether seems an awful lot like a disorder, whether you agree or not. I do not agree. And repeating that you believe we are disordered is an example of the type of comment I would like people like you to stop making, stop insisting, stop reiterating, and stop using to create a culture of compulsory sexuality. It is not a disorder, and plenty of people who actually study sexuality, sociology, and psychology have established why they believe it does not qualify as a disorder, and have established that fact in the current manual for what the psychological community considers disordered, regardless of whether you agree or not. I quote him, perhaps a better word would be abnormality, as I understand no one wants to be labeled with a disorder. maybe you shouldn't be so keen to see us as automatically the have-nots in this situation. It's not a matter of semantics. It's not common, but neither is left-handedness or having red hair. In fact, I think the number of people with red hair is comparable to the number of asexual people, and I don't believe anyone is rushing to make sure they're cool with acknowledging themselves as abnormal. They'll all note, yeah, I do know ginger people sometimes get harassed, but I don't think mainstream voices are trying to get them to consider themselves abnormal or disordered. We're fine with the labels we've chosen to discuss our orientation and experiences with the rest of the world. But remember, you're abnormal just doesn't accomplish anything. Quoting him, "There really is nothing that objectively supports either view." Then you are not reading the studies I linked you to. Quoting him, "Some people may think they need to change asexuals, but those people are no different from the people who feel they need to change gays. It shouldn't matter what others do as long as they aren't hurting anyone. It would be very nice if this attitude was where the investigation stopped. Often it doesn't. Often being asexual is considered the last resort, and people expect and encourage us to pursue painful, dangerous, expensive, stressful, and time-consuming ends, to do absolutely anything in our power to either change ourselves or just make sure that it's not something else. This is a level of investigation and self-examination that is not requested of straight people, and if it truly is for our benefit, we'd prefer people consensually involve us in the process of seeking happiness, rather than spending so much attention and time trying to make us worry and stress out over whether we're normal enough and whether we're missing out. There's just so much pressure that isn't necessary, and the live and let live attitude should be where it starts and ends. In our experience, it doesn't." Quoting him, "There are so many contradictions in that behavior. How can a man physically achieve and sustain an erection, then climax with someone he has zero attraction to sexually? That is not a contradiction, because stimulation generally feels good for the majority of people, and if they are not too repulsed by other factors, sometimes people find it worthwhile. You don't have to be attracted to your hand, or to your vibrator, or to be thinking of anything at all to climax from stimulation. Gay men who aren't attracted to women can still orgasm from having sex with them. You're talking like you think this doesn't happen all the time, and didn't happen throughout history with men who were closeted and fathered children, etc. Not to mention, people frequently have sex that they don't particularly or intrinsically desire, or experience sexual release in the presence of or at the stimulation of people to whom they have no feelings at all. I don't know where you're getting your information about how sex works, but it's pretty weird that I'm a virgin, and I know there's not just one perfect, we're both attracted to each other and that's why we orgasmed version of sex." Quoting him, "Asking if evidence exists to support claims is different than demanding proof. I never demanded proof from you. I asked." "Not exactly. You said the proof didn't exist, and suggested my entire orientation and position is in question and unproven if I didn't or couldn't provide this. It was very aggressive, especially since you opened by asking such a blunt question, and then following with, 'There is no proof that this is real,' which now seems to be mutating into, 'Okay, maybe what you're talking about is real, and it isn't what I thought it was, but I still think there are contradictions in what you're saying that throw doubt on the whole darn thing, and I still think you owe proof, despite the fact that offering proof of a negative in this context is a scientifically impossible scenario. You do not have to be using exclamation points or threatening violence to have the content of your message read as incredibly demanding. And I really wish that if you had so much interest in these studies you keep saying haven't happened, you'd read them when I gave you the explicit information about them." Quoting him, "Not sure why you keep insinuating I don't know the basic definition of asexuality. Just because I'm not as researched and versed on the topic doesn't mean I don't know the basic premise." No, you didn't know the definition, and it looks from this latest message that I'm answering that you were still muddy on it. You continued for several messages to suggest asexual people should be tested to prove whether they can respond sexually, since their identification as asexual suggested to you that they think they can't. I'm not insinuating anything. I said it explicitly, because you were defining asexuality as something it isn't, and suggesting a sex response test would invalidate some people's belief that they were asexual. Quoting him, "Not sure what comments I've made thus far that would lead you to believe I don't understand the basic definition of asexuality, which is simply the lack of sexual attraction to people or lack of sexual desire. This understanding is why I asked my initial question to begin with, because I wasn't sure how someone with no desire and or urges could climax." So again, you're still conflating asexuality with no desire or urges. That right there is an explicitly misleading and incorrect assumption about asexuality, as asexuality is not defined by whether a person can climax or whether they have a libido. Put it this way, if you're horny, you're still horny even if nobody around you is sexy to you. It really can be that simple for us. If you don't understand how those things can be separate, you're not processing what we're claiming about ourselves. Quoting him, "There's nothing inherently aggressive and or negative about asking questions and sharing a different opinion." Asking questions and sharing a differing opinion is not at all what you're doing. I am not flying off the handle because all you did was ask innocent questions and have a different opinion. I've heard opinions that sound like, "I'm sorry, but it's my opinion that race is correlated with intelligence." Why do you have to be so oversensitive to people's politely phrased opinions? And in case it isn't clear, no, that example is not related to anything I think you said. It's an extreme example of how a person can think they're offering something politely, but the very core of it is vile. Expectations are put on the receiver of the opinion that they will calmly accept and understandingly discuss issues with the holders of these opinions as if they haven't just been confronted with an opinion that mocks, erases, or misrepresents their position or identity. You have specifically told me that my orientation is something it isn't, and would not be truly valid without certain data that doesn't objectively exist, even though A, said data does exist, and B, it doesn't disprove asexuality. You have implied that if a discussion is going on about whether we have a disorder, there must be worthwhile points for me to consider that asexuality is indeed a disorder. And you have specifically said that asexuality is in a special category, apart from all other sexual orientations, to require more proof and more inquiry, because the abstinence that supposedly follows from it could also be so many other things, which we presumably would have to prove it isn't, maybe multiple times, before we'd be respected. I understand that you may not be insisting upon or believing these things now, which is even more likely if you looked at any of the items I recommended to you when you kept saying there's not enough research, but this is an explanation for you of why your attempt to call your behavior just asking questions has nothing even close to the innocent and harmless exchange of ideas you say you think it is. Remember that you lose nothing, and your life changes not at all, if you refuse to believe or pay attention to what we ask you to, but we don't have that luxury. Quoting him, "And sorry, but you can't really validate your experience, so I don't have to invalidate it, nor do I want or have a need to, so chill. If someone claims they can walk on water, I want to see the evidence, not to invalidate their claim, but to have their claim validated to me. The burden of proof is on those making the positive claim." The problem with you comparing my orientation to an objective claim about the world is that orientations are by definition subjective. I am not making a claim about the nature of the world, or in fact an extraordinary claim of any kind. A sexual orientation is literally a person saying, "This is a description of what kind of people are sexy to me." If you believe that needs validation by some kind of observable associated behavior, you are creating an impossible situation for asexual people, especially since I'm assuming it would also expect them to be aromantic. And since straight people are not tasked with validating their identity before people believe they're straight, I'm calling BS. I'm not asking for anything but for you to refrain from perpetuating the notion that asexual people are a special category of humans whose orientation is less likely to be believable because there is no test and no outward sign of it. No one, not straight people, not gay people, not anyone else, gets a diagnosis from a doctor for what their orientation is. They say what it is, And then people who aren't pointlessly hostile tend to support them and avoid subjecting them to unnecessary investigations or vocal denials of their experience that they wouldn't drop on someone of another orientation. Though I'll note that plenty of non-straight people get reactions like, "Oh wait, no, you haven't found the right partner yet." We aren't the only ones who get invalidated by people who would not expect any level of scientific proof if someone said they were straight, even if said person did not date or have sex with any cross-sex partners. Quoting him, "And I don't have to agree with your claims. That's not being negative. That's having an objective, unbiased opinion that happens to differ from yours. The fact that you believe you are objective and unbiased is really frightening, considering the misconceptions you brought to this discussion and the continued refusal to read the resources I gave you that you at least pretended you wanted." Quoting him, "I think you are defensive. If you are hurt by anything I've said in this discussion, you are over-emotional in my opinion. I've been one of the lucky ones in my community in that no one ever dragged me to therapy or shot me up with hormones or tried to correctively rape me or subjected me to years of sexual shaming. But those are common narratives in my community. And it does indeed make me furious, not on my own behalf even, when attitudes like yours are held by, say, parents, authorities, mental health practitioners, and partners who have the power to use that compulsory sexuality already so prevalent in society to further mislead and hurt the asexual population. If someone seems outraged, you might want to consider that maybe you did something outrageous. You may very well have a disorder, and you need to come up with some kind of proof to satisfy me is certainly not the worst thing we've dealt with, and it is certainly tame in comparison, considering some people with similar beliefs deliver them in much ruder ways, but you believe and are expressing narratives that make the world dangerous for us. But if it makes you happy to conclude that nothing you said was impertinent, incorrect, misleading, hostile, or indicative of damaging ideas about why asexual people have a burden of proof that you don't believe other orientations have, then that is what you should do. I only ask that you just refer people to existing resources if anyone ever asks you for information on asexuality, because I don't believe you have the understanding or the appropriate attitude to educate on the subject." Quoting him, "As I said, I don't feel people who share your experience need correcting. That's nice, but I'm saying attitudes like yours about proof are what make people believe asexuality is on its own island that should automatically be regarded with disbelief until proof is offered. And yes, I would consider that a burden, which I believe you are happy to place on us, while acknowledging that other orientations do not have this burden if they prove their orientation through partnering with the expected type of partner. The fact that you spent this many words trying to tell me how inappropriate it is for me to feel strongly about this, and called me over-emotional and having a persecution complex, makes it clear you, again, do not accept that any of your approaches or ideas are poisonous to this community. But for us, when people ask those questions over and over again and tell us we are far more likely to have a disorder or a social or behavioral issue than to actually be asexual, and owe the world or anyone who just asks the question proof that it is not requested of other orientations, and need to respect that our identity naturally leads to conversations like this, then you are contributing to a disturbing master narrative about what it means to be asexual in this world. Trying to convince someone that their feelings are inappropriate to the point of mental illness, meaning you have more than once told me I'm imagining persecution and exhibit a pattern of believing this way, even though they are caused by something that is actually happening, is called gaslighting. It is a very bad thing to do to people." Quoting him, "And I know I said my last comment was my last, but I felt compelled to respond, LOL. I'm glad you're enjoying this very funny joke, LOL." Quoting him, "This will, however, be my last comment. Take care. Please don't be lying." So then I was curious about whether this guy does anything else that's awful on the internet, and I clicked his YouTube name. Bam! Immediately there was a comment he'd left on someone else's asexuality video. "Damn, no sexual needs? Sad. I feel sorry for you, missing out on life's greatest pleasure." Wow. Now that definitely sounds like an unbiased, open-minded, objective person who has no agenda against us, right? So I edited my original last response, and I added this on the end. Also, edit. I see you have gone to another asexual person's videos now and posted the following innocent, fair, objective comment. Damn, no sexual needs? Sad. I feel sorry for you, missing out on life's greatest pleasure. If you seriously believe comments like this are polite and honest and unbiased and not causing any problems, you are incredibly out of touch with what this often vulnerable, marginalized population experiences, and I'm finding it very hard to believe you're simply oblivious. Drive-by pity is in no way constructive, and I don't actually believe you think it is. This is really disgusting that you've done this. When I saw another new message from him the next morning, I groaned internally, but it was just this obnoxious nugget. Agree to disagree. Okay then. Yeah, I see this kind of thing a lot when someone really thinks this is just a difference of opinion. And, hey, we can just put our differences aside and agree to disagree. Too bad that when people like him disagree with me, their unbiased and objective opinions actively hurt our community, reinforcing damaging narratives that need to be corrected and stopped. But hey, I mean, I guess we just believe different things and neither of us is truly right. It's not wrong for him to automatically believe that asexual people are less likely to be right about themselves and would need to be tested for proof before they could use that description and be respected, and we need to cast doubt on asexuality whenever someone identifies that way because science. It's just too bad that I interpret attitudes like this as malicious or negative, huh?